Hi, and welcome to an episode of Everything Everywhere Connected. If I were to tell you the story of how an American Republican politician who was once investigated for having been bribed by the Russians made an outrageous proposal to take over Canada, in part to appease his electorate of angry white Americans amidst worries over national security, I'm fairly certain who you would guess this person is. If any of you guessed Donald J. Trump, you would be dead wrong. The person I just described is Nathaniel P. Banks, a US congressman who in 1866 proposed a US congressional bill to annex Canada. So yes, my friends, talk of Canada joining the US is an old and interesting story. And Donald's latest offer is but the latest chapter in this saga. At the outset, trying to get Canada to join the United States is not new as described above. Right from the independence of the United States, various movements within the US and Canada have campaigned in favor of US annexing all or part of Canada. In the early years of the United States, many American political figures were in favor of invading and annexing Canada, and even pre-approved the admission of the province of Quebec, previously called Canada, to the United States in the Articles of Confederation in 1777. In the War of 1812, the Americans invaded Canada in reprisal for the British impressment of American sailors on the high seas. The US at that time was not a strong military force with a strong standing army during its formative years and lost many of the battles to far more experienced British troops who were fighting for British Canada and were therefore repelled back and couldn't hold these territorial gains. Mid-1860s. Several American politicians called for the annexation of Canada because of Britain's material support for the Confederacy, which some historians assert actually lengthened the American Civil War. The story of 1866 I narrated in the beginning of this episode is one example of it. On the Canadian side, unionist movements, which I mean attempts to annex Canada to the US, were usually inspired by dissatisfaction with Britain's colonial government of Canada. Groups of Irish immigrants took the route of armed struggle, attempting to annex the peninsula between the Detroit and Niagara rivers to the US by force, driven in part from the discrimination they faced as Catholics. Despite some unrest, Canadian resentment of the British rule never reached the degree that led to the American Revolution in 1775. In fact, one of the greatest ironies on the Canadian side is that the fear of US annexation was a catalyst in the formation of a more joined up Canadian state from the various bits and pieces held by colonial Britain. In fact, it was the reports of the Annexation Bill of 1866 that I referred to in the beginning of this episode that, contrary to myth, never actually came to a vote that might have been one of the factors behind the Canadian Confederation in 1867. So perhaps talk of takeover actually helped forge a more Canadian state rather than weaken our national identity. I can think of three reasons why support was historically muted in Canada for integration. One, the composition of the early Canadian population with an influx of unionist subjects who had moved out of the US primarily on account of their loyalty to Great Britain during the War of Independence with Britain created resistance to joining with the United States. Two, the presence of a French province in Quebec that feared even more domination by an English-speaking population in a larger United States as opposed to a more manageable balance of power within a Canadian Confederacy. Three, the loss of relevance of Canadians in a larger political system that was often dominated by elites south of the border. As we have moved to more modern times in the 21st century, support on the Canadian side has continued to be very limited for unionization efforts and has been limited to fringe groups such as the Unionist Party, a provisional political party in Saskatchewan in 1980, or the Party 51, which seemed to have been a forerunner of what Trump was saying, which was a short-lived political party in Quebec in the 1980s that advocated Quebec's only admission to the United States as the 51st state. The party won just 3,846 votes, or 0.11% of the popular vote in the province in the 1989 election. Fewer votes than the Marxist-Leninists or the satirical Lemon Party, and was dissolved the following year in 1990. So support for unionization or the Union of Canada to the United States has been very low and consistently low on the Canadian side of the border. However, it would be interesting to see what happened after Trump made his statements. An opinion poll from Leger taken after Trump's comments found that only 13% of Canadians supported the idea of a merger with the United States as compared to 82% who were opposed to it. Another poll from Angus Reid, also taken after the President-elect Trump's comments, put support even lower at just 6% for union or integration with the United States. However, one striking feature was the support for integration was higher among younger Canadians as reported in the Ipsos story. As can be seen in the chart, 87% of respondents over 55 rejected a merger, while only 77% among the 18 to 35-year-olds rejected the same. In fact, 4 in 10 Canadians aged 18 to 34 would vote to be American if citizenship and conversion of assets to US dollars was guaranteed. To analyze this conundrum of why support has historically been low but seems to have been increased in the current poll, I would like to refer to a paper by Tracy Rainey from Ryerson University, as it is helpful in understanding how national identity of Canadian versus Americans has evolved. Rainey reports that on average, Americans define their nationality through a more restrictive lens than most Canadians do. Being born in one's country, living most of one's life in one's country, and being Christian are all important markers of nationality to Americans and seem to be more important than they are to Canadians. Being not American is one of the pillars of Canadian identity. Rainey's paper also challenged one of the central assumptions embedded within the Americanization idea that had gained traction in the mid-80s. As NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and its latest avatar, increased trade integration, there was a fear that it would actually erode Canadian national identity. But contrary to this fear, what actually appears to have happened from the 1980s to the mid-2000s is that increasing cultural and economic integration have appeared to be actually correlated with a strengthened and redefined Canadian identity. Trade and cultural integration don't seem to have to converge in a national identity, but create parallel identities. So what has changed in the younger cohort that this survey has actually showed such high support? The composition of the younger cohort of Canadian citizens is likely to have had a higher share of new immigrants who may have not had a chance to develop a sense of Canadian identity. Additionally, subdued employment, high living and housing costs have singed the younger cohorts the hardest. So therefore, doubts about Canada's long-term viability as expressed in the results of that survey is not surprising. The elephant in the room that is causing this disillusionment remains housing and is a big sore point. Both home ownership and debt levels in Canada due to pricier housing, as described in these charts, has worsened. So while economic integration does not reduce a sense of Canadian identity, weakness in economic prospects job growth, and housing ownership, especially among our younger citizens, can imperil Canadian identity and belief in the Canadian project. So, Canada's economic performance and its divergence from American prospects is a real threat that the Canadian political class needs to manage. Failure to manage this in a country with strong regionalism can lead to more support for attempts at US integration in at least parts of the country. This may or may not be full-fledged merger of sovereignty, but various trade arrangements, customs arrangements, entry-exit arrangements, etc. So the Party 51 experiment that we have seen in Quebec may not be a one-off, but a harbinger of things to come, especially in a country where regionalism has often been a problem. Now, moving on to our American friends south of the border, especially in the Republican Party, an old saying comes to mind: be careful what you wish for. I'm sure the thought of Canada joining the US is just the thing to make America great again. I would, however, say hold on to your MAGA caps, as this may mean the very Messiah who leads you today would not be born. In a country that is as tightly balanced between coastal Democratic majorities and the Republican heartlands, adding in a Canada may not be what the doctor ordered. Assuming a population of 41 million Canadians, that would translate to approximately 50 congressional seats. In the US, congressional seats in the House of Representatives have a voting power or a voting ratio of about 700 to 900,000 residents per seat. Now, assuming a midpoint of voting power yields 50 seats for Canada based on its population, Canada would have a voting power similar to that of California. Canada would in fact be the second largest voting state after California with its 54 seats. Adding in 2 more senators, as is normal for each state, would mean 52 electoral votes in the US presidential voting system. Given a distinct Canadian identity and a population which Seymour Martin Lipset, a famous American sociologist, once described as a more class-aware, law-abiding, statist, and particularistic, that is, with having group salience, a society such as Canada's has political parties such as the Liberals having had longer spells in government. Example, for the 70 of the last 100 years. Our economic and social systems have evolved to meet the societal expectations of such a population. Integrating a population that aligns this way into a finely balanced and divided political machine like the United States may well have consequences unforeseen by Donald Trump. The voting power of a Canadian state would likely swing Democratic. If we take past elections and backtest them by adding in Canadian votes, we see that the results change dramatically. For example, George W. Bush would never have been elected president, and there would have been significantly lower probability for the first Trump presidency. This is because a socially and economically progressive electorate like the one we have in the Canadian state is likely to ensure that all 52 electoral college votes would go to a Democratic presidential contender. The impact of this voting power and its alignment to Democratic type values would be even more pronounced in Senate and House of Representative majorities, where all the recent Republican majorities would be erased. The irony is that Trump is trying to make Canada the 51st state, but given the likely policy shifts a Democratic majority would bring, it is likely that America would end up more like Canada. On a variety of topics such as healthcare, gun rights, abortion rights, indigenous rights, etc., legislative direction in the United States would slip out of the hands of the Republicans. The modern Republican Party does understand this dynamic and may not be a happy camper going along with Donald Trump's plan. This is likely to present a fairly difficult obstacle for Donald Trump to overcome in the United States itself. The border wall may well be an implicit political one on both sides, given the distinct national identities and social contracts that the United States and Canada has adopted. It is the Republicans who have the greatest interest in ensuring that this separation of countries stays. This is perhaps why enthusiasm for such amalgamations has withered among Republicans due to low public support, despite the topic being broached in US and Canada periodically. All this is not to say that Trump has not done Canada a favor by bringing up the cost of sovereignty and our economic interdependencies with the United States into sharp focus. Canada must assert its sovereignty and bear the costs of the same. If our desire to maintain a national identity has to have economic viability, Canada's competitiveness, be it in terms of a diversified commodity export market structure, business regulation, taxation, defense capability, housing costs, trade ties with European Union and Asian markets, has to increase. This is important both to be a viable partner to the US as we continue to increase our economic integration with it, while also making our economic sovereignty less beholden to America. Increasing our own standalone competitiveness, paradoxically, is likely to strengthen our attractiveness and ability to collaborate with the US. The current tariff pain that we are likely to experience in the coming few months, that seems almost inescapable at this stage, is going to hurt, but may force us to increase our national competitiveness. Even though we may retaliate in the short term, increased tariffs, increased integration with the US is a given in the long term, given our inescapable geography, the economic heft of the US in North America, a shared language, and shared elements of culture, despite the US and Canada having separate national identities. Hopefully that integration will happen with a stronger Canada that would have come through this pain of tariffs that we will undergo. So to all my Canadian friends, we are still going to be here because it seems a majority of us believe we are Canadian. But we need to make sure our wallets support our hearts and young people continue to feel this way. And to my American friends, be careful what you wish for. You may just end up making America Canada if Trump's dreams do come to pass.